Cockatoo Island. In the Australian harbour of Sydney, right at the junction of the Parramatta and Llanco rivers, is a small island. In 1869, this was a place that served as a destination for the worst of society. It was a penal institution designed as a special punishment for prisoners. That is, they only came here when they were released from regular prisons and then committed crimes again. Murderers, rapists, child molesters. The convicts were used there to build the largest shipyards the country had ever seen. But it wasn't all just industry that happened on this island. Considering that it was a penal colony for the worst criminals, it's no surprise that the living conditions there were, to say the least, hellish. Cruel punishments were quickly introduced for the smallest of offences. The prisoners were beaten, tortured, or locked for weeks in completely darkened rooms no bigger than a coffin. And deaths from this abuse were practically a daily occurrence. During the time that these shipyards were being built by the prisoners, there were no security measures. The guards who served there were allowed to do whatever they wanted with the prisoners. Eventually, the prison was closed, but things didn't get any better, because a new institution was built on the island. And it was called a home for wayward Aboriginal girls aged 8 to 18. This new institution wasn't much better. There were extremely harsh punishments for the poor children who dared to break the rules of their disciplinary overseers. One researcher described this transition from a prison to a home for girls as follows. Cockatoo Island was chosen as the new site for the girls' institution. But this place was really no better than the prison. The girls received punishments just as draconian as those given to the prisoners before them. These punishments were a daily occurrence, as was sexual abuse. Just like the prisoners before them, some of the girls simply disappeared from the scene. All this has contributed to the dark history of this island, and it seems no surprise that it is said to be haunted. There are reports of workers and visitors being pushed, hit, kicked, and shoved by invisible hands. And it is known, and has been scientifically observed and proven, that electronic equipment on this island does not work properly or simply stops working, regardless of whether they were fully charged beforehand or not. There are reports of disembodied voices, footsteps, and even screams. A number of tourists, to whom this island was open for a while, reported seeing girls in these old ruins. They wore ancient clothing, giggled, and ran around the corridors of the institution. And the tourists reported that when they saw these girls, they were overwhelmed by an indescribable feeling of horror and suffering. There is one girl who is seen there very often and who is identical in all descriptions. She is said to be the daughter of a former caretaker who died rather early, but she is considered to be a rather friendly presence. At most, there is a slap on the hand or someone's hair is stroked. A few years ago, a school class stayed there overnight in their tents. There was administrative staff there who assigned the respective tent sites. An employee of the administrative staff told the following story with this school class. In the morning, when the students had put up their tents to go home, she asked the children how they had slept. Many of them had never slept outside their parents' home, let alone in a tent. All of them had slept well, all except 2 girls. They reported that they were constantly woken up during the night by a little girl in a white dress. The girl had come into the tent, woken them up, and then asked them to play with her. The 2 students then left the tent to see if the girl's parents were anywhere nearby. But neither the parents nor the girl were present. There is also an abnormal, sudden smell on this island. One tourist said that when they were on the island, they were in the commanding officer's residence in the dining room, and there was a strong smell of pipe tobacco. Some believe this is the perfect example of a residual haunting, where something manifests itself based on events that happened many, many years ago. As it stands today, Cockatoo Island is a strange collection of rusted, long-abandoned buildings from another time. Did the suffering that took place here really have a paranormal effect? Or is it simply the minds of people attuned to experiencing the paranormal in such a desolate place that seems tailor-made for it? Coiba. Unlike our first island, this one looks like a tropical paradise at first glance, not like a disturbing place at all. 30 miles off the south coast of Panama lies the lush and beautiful island of Coiba. At 194 square miles, it is the largest uninhabited island in all of Latin America and a great hotspot of biodiversity. The island is home to an amazing variety of plants and animals, both on land and in the sea. A vibrant jewel of natural beauty and biodiversity by all appearances. But hidden in the natural splendor of this paradise lies a place with a violent and dark past buried. A place that is said to be haunted by ghosts and is said to be one of the most haunted places in all of Central America. In 1919, a prison was established on Coiba to house Panama's most dangerous criminals. During the military years of the two dictators Omar Thurios and Manuel Noriega, from 1969 to 1990, the prison was used mainly for those who opposed the military regimes. It became a penal colony with 30 makeshift prison camps. Coiba gained a reputation as hell on earth, as it was the last place anyone wanted to be sent to. With its treacherous mountains, almost impenetrable rainforests full of poisonous snakes, crocodiles, and the surrounding shark-infested waters full of strong currents, and the nearest island 6 hours away by boat, Coiba was considered absolutely inescapable and full of dangers that destroyed any hope of freedom. Added to the harsh terrain of the place were the terrible conditions the prisoners endured. The prisoners' days were filled with back-breaking work in the fields, with only one lunch break per day. Torture and harassment, both physical and psychological, were commonplace among the guards. One of the guards' favorite pastimes was to lead the prisoners into the dark forest and perform fake executions, so that the prisoners would expect death but would only be briefly frightened and work another day. Of course, they sometimes carried out real executions to keep up appearances. So, with this in mind, you were never sure what would happen when you were led out into the mosquito-infested jungle and a gun was put to your head. Was this the final moment or just a cruel torture by the guards? The prisoners were locked in tiny, cramped cells with no windows, furniture, or bathrooms. They lived in their own excrement and had almost no human contact, which caused many of them to lose their minds and eventually go insane. Many prisoners died in these harsh conditions. Their bodies were thrown to sharks in the surrounding waters, or simply buried in unmarked graves. And indeed, several mass graves were discovered on the island. Although there was no official death penalty in Panama, exile to Coiba was considered a death sentence. Many people were brought to this island and never heard from again. The population simply called these poor souls desperados, meaning the ones who disappeared. At its peak, Coiba housed more than 3,000 prisoners, although the number of those who died here is unknown. This gruesome history naturally gave rise to ghost stories surrounding Coiba. Locals refused to go anywhere near the place. And even before the prison closed in 2004, there were stories of supernatural terror. Prisoners often complained of being threatened by shadowy figures in their rooms or hallways, that they heard noises at night such as clattering, banging, moaning, or screaming that could not be explained, that doors opened and closed by themselves, and that the ghost of a guard walked through the hallways, dragging his baton along the bars of the cells. The whole thing was apparently so drastic that some of the prisoners preferred to try to escape, even though they knew that nature would kill them anyway. This was true not only for the prisoners, but also for the guards. There is a written report from this prison in which a guard was chasing a convict who was obviously on the run. But when he caught up with him, he noticed that he was a supernatural figure. This frightened the guard so much that he apparently killed himself a short time later. For the guards, too, there was no escape from this island, and you couldn't just quit. This particular guard had apparently preferred to end his life, rather than continue to be exposed to this haunting. The prison has long been abandoned and has turned into a weed-covered, overgrown ruin. The government is trying to turn it into a kind of eco-tourism destination, but the island's dark reputation has made this extremely difficult so far. Dead Man's Island. Located in Canada, Dead Man's Island earned its foreboding name due to its use as a burial ground by the local indigenous Squamish people. The island's history is deeply intertwined with indigenous culture and spiritual practices. According to local legends, it was considered a place where the spirits dwelled, and it served as a final resting place for chiefs and other esteemed community members. However, the island's serene role as a sacred burial ground was soon overshadowed by more sinister events following European contact. The dark chapter of Dead Man's Island began in the late 19th century, following the arrival of European settlers. In 1862, a devastating smallpox epidemic swept through the indigenous populations in the area. The island became a quarantine site where many afflicted indigenous people were isolated and left to succumb to the disease. The bodies were often buried in mass graves or left exposed, further cementing the island's morbid aura. The tragic losses during this period are believed to contribute significantly to the island's haunted legacy. The turn of the century saw Dead Man's Island transformed into a military site. During World War I, the island was used as a training ground for Canadian soldiers. Later, in the 1920s, it became the site of a naval reserve. The constant presence of military personnel on an island with such a grim past only added to its eerie atmosphere. The soldiers stationed there reported strange occurrences, such as unexplained noises, ghostly apparitions, and a pervasive sense of unease. Perhaps the most infamous episode in the island's history occurred in 1942. During World War II, Dead Man's Island served as a prisoner of war camp. Japanese Canadians were forcibly relocated to the island under the War Measures Act, an event that remains a painful chapter in Canadian history. The conditions on the island were harsh, and the prisoners endured significant hardships. Ghost stories and paranormal activities have long been associated with Dead Man's Island. Visitors and workers on the island have reported numerous eerie encounters. Some claim to have seen the apparitions of indigenous people, believed to be the restless spirits of those who perished during the smallpox epidemic. Another common tale involves the ghost of a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, often seen near the island's shoreline. Some speculate that she might be connected to the tragic deaths during the island's use as a quarantine. Despite its grim past, Dead Man's Island remains an important historical site. Today, it is primarily used by the Royal Canadian Navy, restricting public access and preserving the island's natural state. The dense forest and untouched landscape maintain an air of mystery, and the stories of its haunted history continue to capture the imagination of locals and visitors alike.